by KenWilber, Chapter 9, The Self in Transcendence. As we now leave the centaur level and move towards the transpersonal bands, we leave behind familiarity and common sense orientations to ourselves and our worlds, for we are entering the world of beyond and above, where we begin to touch an awareness that transcends the individual and discloses to a person something which passes far beyond himself. Any sort of legitimate discipline on this level sooner or later opens the individual to an awareness in himself that is so deep and profound that it may lift him out of himself into the vast and subtle world of the transpersonal. But alas, such talk as this engenders little more than bewilderment in most modern well-educated Westerners, for with the general anemia of present-day religion, we have largely lost any direction and socially accessible means to transcendence. The average person will therefore probably listen in disbelief if it is pointed out that she has nestled in the deepest recesses of her being a transpersonal self, a self that transcends her individuality and connects her to a world beyond conventional space and time. It is unfortunate that we live in the West. Over the past few centuries, It is unfortunately that we in the West over the past few centuries have increasingly tended to repress the transcendent. This repression, extensive as it is subtle, is undoubtedly more responsible for the discontents of our present unhappy civilization than any amount of repression of sexuality, hostility, aggression, or other superficial repressions operating on the upper levels of the spectrum. Repressions of the persona, ego, or centaur levels, frantic and dramatic as they may be, are not encompassing enough to set the tone of a whole society, the roots of which are always knowingly or unknowingly set in the soil of transcendence. This fact we have somehow managed to collectively deny. However, because the repressed is never really banished, but merely lies dormant, gathering strength or seeps to the surface in disguised forms, we see today an increasing eruption of repressed transcendence. It is taking the form of an interest in meditation, psychic phenomena, yoga, oriental religions, altered states of consciousness, biofeedback, out-of-body experiences, and near-death states. And because it has generally been repressed for so long, this urge to transcend occasionally takes on bizarre or exaggerated forms, such as black magic, occultism, misuse of psychedelic drugs, and cultic guru worship. Yet, with all this outbreak of transcendence, most Westerners still have a great deal of difficulty comprehending how it could be that something deep within them actually transcends space and time, how there could be an awareness within them which, because it transcends the individual, is free of personal problems, tensions, and anxieties. So instead of jumping directly into the middle of a discussion of this transpersonal self, I'd like, by way of introduction, to briefly discuss the works of Carl Jung, Freud's most distinguished student. This will supply some necessary background information that, in many other cultures, would have been supplied in one form or another to a person from the time of his birth. Jung began studying with Freud at the beginning of this century, and although Freud had designated Jung as his sole successor and crown prince, within a decade Jung had broken with Freud over doctrinal disagreements. After that celebrated parting of the ways, the two great men never spoke again to one another. The basis of their mutual incompatibilities stemmed from the fact, mentioned in the first chapter, that any psychological researcher investigating a particular level of the spectrum will generally acknowledge as real all levels on and above his own, but will often deny reality to any deeper level than his own. He will proclaim these deeper levels to be pathological, illusory, or non-existent. Freud had ended up confining his remarkable and courageous investigation to the ego, persona, and shadow. But Jung, while fully acknowledging these upper levels, managed to push his explorations all the way down to the transpersonal bands. Jung was the first major European psychologist to discover and explore significant aspects of the transpersonal realm of human awareness. Freud could not comprehend this, confined as he was to the upper levels, and thus the two men traveled their separate paths. But what especially did Jung stumble onto? What did he discover in the very depths of the human soul that pointed unmistakably to a transpersonal realm? What in a person could possibly be beyond a person? To begin with, Jung had spent a great deal of time studying world mythology, the whole pantheons of Chinese, Egyptian, Amerindian, Greek, Roman, African, and Indian gods and goddesses and demons and divinities, totems and animisms, ancient symbols, images, and mythological motifs. What amazed Jung was that these primitive mythological images also appeared regularly and unmistakably in the dreams and fantasies of modern civilized Europeans, the vast majority of whom had never been exposed to these myths. At least they did not possess the formidable and astonishingly accurate knowledge of mythology displayed in their dreams. This information was not acquired during their lifetimes, and thus Jung reasoned, in some sense or another, these basic mythological motifs must be innate structures inherited by every member of the human race. These primordial images, or archetypes as Jung called them, are thus common to all people. They belong to no single individual, but are instead trans-individual, collective, and transcendent. This is a plausible hypothesis, especially if one carefully examines the realms of meticulously detailed data reported by Jung. Just as, for example, each person possesses 1 heart, 2 kidneys, 10 fingers, 4 limbs, and so on, so each person's brain might contain universal symbolic forms, essentially identical to those of all other human brains. The human brain itself is millions of years old, and over that vast expanse of time it necessarily evolved certain basic, and in this sense mythological, ways of perceiving and grasping reality, just as our hands evolved in some special ways to grasp physical objects. These basic imaginative mythological ways of grasping reality are the archetypes, and because every person's basic brain structure is similar, every person may house within him the same basic mythological archetypes, since they are common to all people by simple virtue of a shared membership in the human race. Jung called this deep layer of the psyche the collective unconscious. It is, in other words, not individual nor personal, but supra-individual, transpersonal, transcendent. Buried deep in every person's being is the mythology of transcendence, and ignoring this powerful layer can only have the most regrettable consequences. Parts of the unconscious, corresponding with the persona, ego, and centaur levels, contain personal memories, personal wishes, and ideas and experiences and potentials. But the deeper realms, the collective unconscious within you, contains nothing strictly personal whatsoever. Rather, it houses the collective motifs of the entire human race. All the gods and goddesses, divinities and demons, heroes and villains portrayed outwardly in the world's ancient mythologies are contained, in condensed form, in the depths of your own being. Whether we know it or not, according to Jung, they live on and continue to move us deeply in both creative and destructive, in ways both creative and destructive. The aim of some type of transpersonal band therapy, just as Jung's is, therefore, to help us consciously acknowledge, befriend, and utilize these powerful forces instead of being moved by them unconsciously and against our wills. You might, for example, have a key dream where the central image is a sphinx, a gorgon, a great serpent, a winged horse, or some other mythological material. Through a little study of ancient mythology, you can easily learn that these mythological images have meant what these have meant to the human race on the whole, and thereby discover what these images mean to your own collective unconscious. By integrating this meaning into your conscious awareness, you are no longer forcibly controlled by it. The depths of your soul thus begin to loosen, and the crusty topsoil of normal egoic or centauric awareness begins to gently break apart to allow a growth of the transcendent, a growth of those processes which transcend your personal life, but which are nevertheless aspects of a deeper self. Let us examine in this context of archetypal awareness just how this shift to a deeper self, a transpersonal self, might occur. As the individual begins to reflect on her life through the eyes of the archetypes, mythological images common to humankind, her awareness may begin to shift to a more universal perspective. She is looking at herself not through her own eyes, which are in some ways prejudiced, but through the eyes of the collective human spirit. A different view indeed. She is no longer exclusively preoccupied with her own personal vantage point. In fact, if this process quickens correctly, her identity, her very self, expands qualitatively to these more or less global dimensions, and her soul becomes saturated with depth. She is no longer exclusively identified with just her ego or centaur, and thus she is no longer suffocated by purely personal problems and dramas. In a sense, she can let go of her individual concerns and view them with creative detachment, realizing that whatever problems her personal self faces, her deeper self transcends them to remain untouched, free, and open. She finds, haltingly at first, but then with ever-increasing certainty, a quiet source of inner strength that persists unperturbed, like the depths of the ocean, even though the surface waves of consciousness are swept by torrents of pain, anxiety, or despair. The discovery, in one form or another, of this transcendent self is the major aim of all transpersonal band therapies and disciplines. However, the mythological approach we have been discussing thus far is by no means the only path to the transcendent self. To every level of the spectrum there exists numerous different approaches, and individuals may have to experiment somewhat in determining which is best for them. I have dwelt on the mythological as a convenient introduction to the realm of the transpersonal, but the strictly mythological route is a difficult one, and usually demands a professional assistant to help guide you through the vast maze of the world's mythologies and your own archetypal layer. There are simpler approaches to the transcendent self, not necessarily shorter or easier, but much less delicate and complicated. Individuals can undertake these on their own and pursue them under their own initiative. These are the approaches we will now explore. Notice first of all the broad, distinguishing marks of the transcendent self. It is a center and expansive awareness which is creatively detached from one's personal mind, body, emotions, thoughts, and feelings. So if you would like to begin to work at intuiting this transcendent self within you that goes beyond you, the you that is not you, then proceed as follows. Begin with 2 or 3 minutes of centaur awareness as described in the last chapter, for the simple reason that you will then be more or less in touch with the centaur level, and that much closer to the transpersonal bands beneath it. Then slowly begin to silently recite the following to yourself, trying to realize as vividly as possible the import of each sentence. I have a body, but I am not my body. I can see and feel my body, but what can be seen and felt is not the true seer. My body may be tired or excited, sick or healthy, heavy or light, but that has nothing to do with my inward I. I have a body, but I am not my body. I have desires, but I am not my desires. I can know my desires, and what can be known is not the true knower. Desires come and go, float through my awareness, but they do not affect my inward I. I have desires, but I am not desires. I have emotions, but I am not my emotions. I can feel and sense my emotions, and what can be felt and sensed is not the true feeler. Emotions pass through me, but they do not affect my inward I. I have emotions, but I am not emotions. I have thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. I can know and intuit my thoughts, and what can be known is not the true knower. Thoughts come to me and thoughts leave me, but they do not affect my inward I. I have thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. This done, perhaps several times, one then affirms as concretely as possible, I am what remains, a pure center of awareness, an unmoved witness of all these thoughts, emotions, feelings, and desires. If you persist in such an exercise, the understanding contained in it will quicken, and you might begin to notice fundamental changes in your sense of self. For example, you might begin intuiting a deep inward sense of freedom, lightness, release, stability. This source, this center of the cyclone, will retain its lucid stillness even amid the raging winds of anxiety and suffering that might swirl around its center. The discovery of this witnessing center is very much like diving from the calamitous waves on the surface of a stormy ocean to the quiet and secure depths of the bottom. At first, you might not get more than a few feet beneath the agitated waves of emotion, but with persistence, you may gain the ability to dive fathoms into the deep, quiet depths, into the quiet depths of your soul, and lying outstretched at the bottom, gaze up in alert but detached fashion at the turmoil that once held you transfixed. Here we are talking of the transpersonal self or witness. We are not yet discussing pure unity consciousness. In unity consciousness, the transpersonal witness itself collapses into everything witnessed. Before that can occur, however, one must first discover that transpersonal witness, which then acts as an easier jumping-off point for unity consciousness. This chapter is devoted to the witness. The next chapter, its collapse into unity, and we find this transpersonal witness by disidentifying with all particular objects, mental, emotional, or physical, thereby transcending them. To the extent that you actually realize that you are not, for example, your anxieties, then your anxieties no longer threaten you. Even if anxiety is present, it no longer overwhelms you because you are no longer exclusively tied to it. You are no longer courting it, fighting it, resisting it, or running from it. In the most radical fashion, anxiety is thoroughly accepted as it is and allowed to move as it will. You have nothing to lose, nothing to gain by its presence or absence, for you are simply watching it pass by. Thus any emotion, sensation, thought, memory, or experience that disturbs you is simply one which you have exclusively identified yourself, and the ultimate resolution of the disturbance is to simply disidentify with it. You cleanly let all of them drop away by realizing that they are not you. Since you can see them, they cannot be this true seer and subject. Since they are not your real self, there is no reason whatsoever for you to identify with them, hold on to them, or allow yourself to be bound by them. Slowly, gently, as you pursue this disidentification therapy, quote-unquote therapy, you may find that your entire individual self, persona, ego, centaur, which hitherto you have fought to defend and protect, begins to go transparent and drop away. Not that it literally falls off and you find yourself floating disembodied through space. Rather, you begin to feel that what happens to your personal self, your wishes, hopes, desires, hurts, is not a matter of life or death seriousness, because there is within you a deeper and more basic self which is not touched by these peripheral fluctuations, these surface waves of grand commotion but feeble substance. Thus your personal mind and body may be in pain or humiliation or fear, but as long as you abide as the witness of these affairs, as if from on high, they no longer threaten you, and thus you are no longer moved to manipulate them, wrestle with them, or subdue them. Because you are willing to witness them, to look at them impartially, you are able to transcend them. As St. Thomas puts it, quote, "Whatever knows certain things cannot have any of them in its own nature," unquote. Thus, if the eye were colored red, it wouldn't be able to perceive red objects. It can see red because it is clear or redless. Likewise, if we can but watch or witness our distress, we prove ourselves thereby to be distressless, free of witness turmoil. That within which feels pain is itself painless. That which feels fear is fearless. That which perceives tension is tensionless. To witness these states is to transcend them. They no longer seize you from behind because you look at them up front. Thus we can understand why Patanjali, the codifier of yoga in India, said that ignorance is the identification of the seer with the instruments of the seeing. Every time we become exclusively identified with or attached to the persona, ego, or centaur, then anything which transcends their existence or standards seems to threaten our very self. Thus every attachment to thoughts, sensations, feelings, or experiences is merely another link in the chain of our own self-enslavement. In all previous chapters we have spoken of quote-unquote therapy as a quote-unquote expanding unquote of identity, but now rather abruptly we are seeking to disidentify. Isn't this contradictory? Actually, these are but two ways of speaking about a single process. Look again at figure 1 and notice, for example, the descent from the persona to the ego level. Okay, we're going to go back to figure 1 and I'll explain it again, even though I've talked about it a bunch already. So figure 1 has 4 different lines that are that are on the horizon. The top line is the shortest, and it's the persona level. The second line is the second to shortest, and it's the ego level. The third line is as long as it can be, it's the total organism. And the fourth line is as long as it can be, and it's unity consciousness. And then the first three lines have a slash through them. The persona level is divided by the slash into persona and shadow. The ego level is divided into ego and body. And the total organism is divided into total organism or centaur and environment. And then between the total organism and unity consciousness, we have three bands, and they're divided partly by slashes, dotted slashes. And then at the bottom of unity consciousness, instead of having two sides, we have only one line, and it says universe, manifest, and unmanifest. So look again at figure 1 and notice, for example, the descent from the persona to the ego level. Two things have happened in this particular descent. One, the individual identifies with the shadow, but two, he disidentifies with it and breaks his exclusive attachment to his persona. His new identity, the ego, is thus a synergistic composition of both persona and shadow. Likewise, to transcend the centaur level, a person extends his identity to the body while disidentifying with the ego alone. In each case, not only do we expand to a new and broader identity, we also break an old and narrow one. In the same way, we expand to the broader identity of the transcendent self by gently breaking or letting go of our narrower identity with the centaur alone. We disidentify with the centaur, but in the direction of depth and expanse. Thus we begin to touch the transpersonal witness. We begin to let go of our purely personal problems, worries, and concerns. In fact, and this is the entire key of the most transpersonal band therapies, we don't even try to solve our problems or distresses. We surely would and should on the persona, ego, or centaur level, as we surely would and should on the persona, ego, or centaur levels. For our only concern here is to watch our particular distress, to simply and innocently be aware of them without judging them, avoiding them, dramatizing them, working on them, or justifying them. As a feeling or tendency arises, we witness it. If hatred or that feeling arises, we witness that. If hatred of the hatred arises, then we witness that. Nothing is to be done, but if a doing arises, we witness that. Abide as choiceless awareness, quote-unquote choiceless awareness, in the midst of all distress. This is possible only when we understand that none of them constitute our real self. As long as we are attached to them, there will be an effort, however subtle, to manipulate them. Understanding that they are not the center or self, we don't call our distresses names, yell at them, resent them, try to reject them, or indulge them. Every time we make to solve a distress distress simply reinforces the illusion that we are that particular distress. Thus, ultimately, to try to escape a distress merely perpetuates that distress. What is so upsetting is not the distress itself, but our attachment to that distress. We identify it, and that alone is the real difficulty. Instead of fighting a distress, we simply assume the innocence of detached impartiality towards it. The mystics and sages are fond of likening the state of witnessing to a mirror. We simply reflect any sensations or thoughts that arise without clinging to them or pushing them away, just as a mirror perfectly and impartially reflects whatever passes in front of it. Says Lao Tzu, quote, "The perfect person employs the mind as a mirror. It grasps nothing, it refuses nothing, it receives, but it does not keep." End of quote. If you are at all successful in developing this type of detached witnessing, it does take time, you will be able to look upon the events occurring in your mind and body with the very same impartiality that you would look upon the clouds floating through the sky, water rushing in a stream, rain cascading on a roof, or any other objects in your field of awareness. In other words, your relationship to your mind and body becomes the same as your relationship to all other objects. Hitherto, you have been using your mind and body as something with which to look at the world. Thus, you became intimately attached to them and bound to their limited perspective. You became identified exclusively with them, and thus you were tied and bound to their problems, pains, and distress. But by persistently looking at them, you realize they are merely objects of awareness, in fact, objects of transpersonal witness. I have a mind and body and emotions, but I am not a mind and body and emotions. It is important to affirm that just because a person begins to contact or even totally shift to the transpersonal bands, she does not lose access to or control over any of the upper levels of the spectrum. Remember that as an individual descends from an exclusive identity with the persona to a fuller and more accurate identity with her total ego, she does not lose access to the persona, she is just no longer stuck to it. She can still don her persona, if for instance she chooses to put on a good show, or a temporary social facade for practical and decorous purposes. But she is no longer chronically anchored to that role. Formerly she could not drop the facade, even for others. And here is the problem, herself. Now, however, she can simply use it or not, depending upon circumstances and her own discretion. If she decides to put on her good face, her persona, then she consciously and temporarily checks her shadow, not showing her negative aspects. She is still capable of being aware of them, however, and thus she doesn't project them. So the persona in itself is not maladaptive or problem-generating, unless it's the only self you have. Thus, what is dissolved when one descends from the persona level to the ego level is not the shadow or the persona, but the boundary and the battle between them. Likewise, when you descend to the centaur level from the ego level, you don't destroy the ego or the body, but simply the boundary between them. On the centaur level, you still have access to the ego, the body, the persona, the shadow, but because you are no longer exclusively identified with one as against the others, all of these elements work in harmony. You have befriended them all and touched each with acceptance. There are no intractable boundaries between them, and so no major battles. In the same way, as you contract the transpersonal self, you still have access to all the levels above it. No longer, however, will you be tied to those levels, bound to them, or limited by them. They become instrumental, not essential. Thus, as a person begins this creative detachment from the exclusive identification with the insulated organism, he in no way ceases caring for his organism. He doesn't stop eating, living, etc. Actually, the reverse is the case. One becomes more caring and accepting of the mind and body. Since one is no longer bound by them, they no longer appear as freedom-robbing prison. Thus, the person's energies are not frozen in a suppressed rage and hatred for his own organism. The organism of a whole becomes a perfectly accepted expression of the transpersonal self. As we mentioned earlier, from the position of the transcendent witness, one begins to view the mind and body in the same way one would view any other objects of awareness, be it a table, a tree, a dog, a car. This might sound as though we treat our organism with the disdain that we occasionally show the environment, but it actually works to the other side. We begin to treat all environmental objects as if they were our own self. In fact, this attitude represents the intuition that the world is really one's body, and it is to be treated as such. It is from this type of transpersonal intuition that the universal compassion is so empathized to the mystic springs. This is Mystic's Springs, it says. This is a different order of compassion or love than one finds on the persona, ego, or centaur level. At the transpersonal level, we begin to love others not because they love us, affirm us, reflect us, or secure us in our illusions, but because they are us. Christ's primary teaching does not mean love your neighbor as you love yourself, but love your neighbor as yourself. And not just your neighbor, but your whole environment. You begin to care for your surroundings as you would for your own arms and legs. At this level, remember your relationship to your environment is the same as your relationship to your very own organism. At the level of the transpersonal witness, the archetypal self, you might also begin to regain a fundamental intuition, an intuition you probably possessed as a child, namely that since consciousness fundamentally transcends the separate organisms, then 1, it is single, and 2, it is immortal. Almost every child wonders at some time or other, what would I be like if I had different parents? In other words, the child realizes, in a very innocent and inarticulate fashion, that consciousness itself, that inner witness or I-ness, is not solely limited by the particular outer forms of mind and body that it animates. Every child seems to sense that he would still be I, even if he had different parents and a different body. The child knows that he would look different and act different, but he would still be an I. I have a mind and a body and emotions, but I am not the mind and body and emotions. The child asks this question: what would I still be me if I had different parents? Because he wants the parents to explain his transcendence, the fact that he would still seem to be and feel the same inner I-ness, even though he had different parents. The parents have probably long ago forgotten their own transpersonal self, and so cannot give an answer acceptable to the child. But for a moment most parents are taken aback and sense there is something of immense importance here that somehow they can't just quite remember. Anyone who fundamentally begins to intuit the transpersonal self might realize that there is but one self, taking on these different outward forms, and every person has the identical intuition of the same I-ness transcending the body. The single self clearly transcends the mind and the body, and thus is essentially one and the same in all conscious beings. Just as a person can walk out of one room and into another without fundamentally changing his inward feeling of I-ness, so also he would not be fundamentally different if he possessed a different body, with different memories and different sensations. He is the witness of these objects, but he is not tied to them. The insight that the transcendent self passes beyond the individual organism also carries with it the intuition of immortality. Most people harbor the inward feeling that they are immortal. They cannot imagine their own non-existence. Nobody can. But the average person, because he exists only at the centaur, ego, or persona, falsely imagines and deeply wishes that his individual self will live forever. It is not true that the mind, ego, or body is immortal. They, like the composites, will die. They are dying now, and not one of them will survive eternally. Reincarnation does not mean that your ego moves through successive existences, but that the transcendent self is the one and only transmigrant, as Shankara himself puts it. In a certain sense, therefore, we have to die to our false separate self in order to awaken to our immortal and transcendent self. Thus the famous paradox: if you die before you die, then when you die, you won't die. And the sayings of the mystics that no one gets as much of God as the one who is thoroughly dead. This is why so many people who consciously practice some form of transpersonal therapy report that they no longer really fear death. Perhaps we can approach this fundamental insight of the mystics and sages. But there is but one immortal self common in and to all of us, in yet another way. Perhaps you, like most people, feel that you are basically the same person you were yesterday. You probably also feel that you are fundamentally the same person you were a year ago, and indeed, you still seem to be the same person, the same you, as far back as you can remember. Indeed, you still put in another way, you never remember a time when you weren't you. In other words, something in you seems to remain untouched by the passage of time. But surely your body is not the same as it was even a year ago. Surely your sensations are different today than in the past. Surely, too, your memories are on the whole different today than a decade ago. Your mind, your body, your feelings, all have changed with time. But something has not changed, and you know that something has not changed. Something feels the same. What is that? This time a year ago, you had different concerns and basically different problems, and your immediate experiences were different, and so were your thoughts. All of these had vanished, but something in you remains. Go one step further. What if you moved to a completely different country with new friends and new surroundings and new experiences and new thoughts? You would still have the same basic inner feeling of I-ness. Further yet, what if you right now forgot the first 10 years or 15 years or 20 years of your life? You would still feel the same inner I-ness, wouldn't you not? If right now you just temporarily forgot everything that happened in your past and just feel the pure inner I-ness, has anything really changed? There is, in short, something within you, that deep inward sense of I-ness that is not memory, thoughts, body, experience, surroundings, feelings, conflicts, sensations, or moods. For all of these have changed and can change without substantially affecting that inner I-ness. That is what remains untouched by the flight of time, and that is the transpersonal witness and self. Is it then so different to realize that every conscious being has the same inner I-ness, and that therefore the overall number of transcendent I's is but one? We have already surmised that if you had a different body, you would still basically feel the same I-ness, but that is already the very same way every other person feels right now. Isn't it just as easy to say that it is but one single I-ness or self taking on different views, different memories, different feelings, and different sensations? And not just at this time, but at different times, past and future. Since you undoubtedly feel, even though your memory, mind, and body are different, that you are the same person of 20 years ago, not the same ego or body, but the same I-ness. Couldn't you also be the same I-ness of 200 years ago? If I-ness isn't dependent upon memories and mind and body, what difference would it make? In the words of physicist Schrödinger, quote, "It is not possible that this unity of knowledge, feeling, and choice, which you call your own, should have sprung into being from nothingness at a given moment not so long ago. Rather, this knowledge, feeling, and choice are essentially eternal and unchanged, and numerically one in all men, nay, in all sensitive beings. The condition of your existence are almost as old as the rocks. For thousands of years men have striven and suffered and begotten, and women have brought forth in pain. And 100 years ago, perhaps, another man sat down on this spot, and like you, he gazed with awe and yearning in his heart in the dying light of the glaciers. Like you, he was begotten of men and born of women, and he felt pain and a brief joy as you do. Was he someone else? Was it not you yourself?" Unquote. As we say, that couldn't have been me, because I can't remember what happened then. But that is to make the mistake of identifying I-ness with memories. And we just saw that I-ness is not a memory, but the witness of memory. Besides, you can't even remember what happened to you last month, but you are still I-ness. So what if you can't remember what happened last century? You are still that transcendent I-ness, and that I, there's only one in the whole cosmos, is the same I which awakens in every newborn being, the same I which looked out from our ancestors and will look out from our descendants, and the one and the same I. We feel they are different only because we make the error of identifying the inward and transpersonal I-ness with the outward and individual memory, mind, and body, which indeed are different. But as for that inward I, indeed, what is that? It is not born with your body, nor will it perish upon death. It does not recognize time or cater to its distresses. It is without color, without shape, without form, without size, yet it beholds the entire majesty before your eyes. It sees the sun, clouds, stars, and moon, but it cannot be seen. It hears the birds, the crickets, the singing waterfall, but cannot itself be heard. It grasps the fallen leaf, the crusted rock, the knotted branch, but cannot itself be grasped. We needn't try to see your transcendent self, which is not possible anyway. Can your eye see itself? You need only begin by persistently dropping your false identifications with your memories, mind, body, emotions, and thoughts. And this dropping entails nothing by way of superhuman effort or theoretical comprehension. All that is required primarily is but one understanding. Whatever you can see cannot be the seer. Everything you know about yourself is precisely not yourself, the knower, the inner I-ness, that can neither be perceived or defined or made an object of any sort. Bondage is nothing but the misidentification of the seer with all these things that can be seen, and liberation begins with a simple reversal of that mistake. Any time you identify with a problem, an anxiety, a mental state, a memory, a desire, a bodily sensation, or emotion, you are throwing yourself into bondage, limitation, fear, constriction, and ultimately death. These all can be seen, unless you're not the seer. On the other hand, to continuously abide as the seer, the witness, the self, is to step aside from limitations and problems, and then finally to step out of them. This is a simple but arduous practice. Yet its results constitute nothing less than liberation in this life, and the transcendent self is everywhere acknowledged as a ray of the divine. In principle, your transcendent self is of one nature with God, however you might wish to conceive it. For it is finally, ultimately, profoundly God alone who looks through your eyes, listens with your ears, speaks with your tongue. How else would St. Clement maintain that he who knows himself knows God? This, then, is the message of Young. The more and more of the saints, sages, and mystics, whether Amerindian, Taoist, Hindu, Islamic, Buddhist, or Christian. At the bottom of your soul is the soul of humanity itself. but a divine transcendent soul leading from bondage to liberation, from enchantment to awakening, from time to eternity, from death to immortality. Recommendations. There are so many aspects of the transpersonal bands and so many different approaches, so we will take them in groups. For the works of C.G. Jung, Joseph Campbell, The Portable Jung is an excellent anthology of Jung's own writings and is highly recommended. For an overall introduction to Jung's analytical psychology, see Bennett, E.A., What Jung Really Said. The serious student is directed to an outstanding comparison of Freud and Jung systems, Lillian Frey Robin, From Freud to Jung. For a practical do-it-yourself but extremely effective approach to Jungian type therapy, I highly recommend Ira Progoff's At a Journal workshop. For Maslow's groundbreaking study of the transpersonal, this is the next section, see his Toward a Psychology of Being, and the farther reaches of human nature. For those interested in traditional psychologies, see C-Tart, Transparent Psychologies. Well-rounded anthologies include J. White, The Highest State of Consciousness, J. Wellwood, Meeting of the Ways, R. Walsh and F. Vagau, Beyond Ego. I said that wrong, sorry. Francis, I'll say it wrong again. Vaughan, V-A-U-G-H-A-N, has also written a valuable book, Awakening Intuition, about just that. My own books, The Spectrum of Consciousness, The Atman Project, try to put as much of this material in perspective. If you're a psychiatrist and would appreciate a more cautious approach, try SDL, Psychiatry and Mysticism. Next section. Psychosynthesis represents a sound and effective approach to the transcendent self in no uncertain terms. The book Psychosynthesis by its founder Roberto Assagioli is an encompassing introduction. The exercise in disidentification given in this chapter was adapted from this book. For important data from psychiatric research, see S. Groff, Realms of the Human Unconscious. Next section. For the transcendent unity of religions and the perennial philosophy in general, see F. Schwann, The Transcendent Unity of Religions. Houston Smith's The Forgotten Truth is the best introduction to the field for the general reader. Next section. As for the meditation and transpersonal, a useful anthology is J. White, What is Meditation? But I should say here that many approaches to the transpersonal bands also aim through these bands to the levels of unity conscious, so I am rather arbitrarily dividing my recommendations between those to list here and those to include in the next chapter. In general, those listed here usually establish as a type of halfway house a base of awareness in the transpersonal bands and then proceed to the level of unity consciousness from there, if they proceed at all. The transpersonal bands are actually composed of several sublevels, and different types of meditation seem to address these different sublevels. For the Kundalini division, say J. White, Kundalini, Evolution, Enlightenment. For the subtler aspects known as Nada or Shabd, the reader is directed to any of the works by Kirpal Singh. Because transcendental meditation is simple, effective, and most important, readily accessible, it would be one of my first recommendations for an introduction to this type of meditation. My final recommendation for meditation in general are reserved for the next chapter. Chapter 10, The Ultimate State of Consciousness, starts with a poem. There is neither creation nor destruction, neither destiny nor free will, neither path nor achievement. This is the final truth. Sri Ramana Maharshi. Since unity consciousness is of the timeless moment, it is entirely present now, and obviously there is no way to reach now. There is no way to arrive at that which already is. Hence, as Ramana suggests, there is no path to unity consciousness, and this he proclaims the final truth. This seems an odd, or at least frustrating conclusion, especially since we have just spent so much time exploring some of the practical ways we could contact the other levels of the spectrum. In the past few chapters, we have seen that there are certain practices, techniques, and disciplines which could facilitate descent to any of the other levels. Now the reason we could contract these levels is that they are partial, i.e. less than comprehensive states of consciousness. They are different from other levels, and therefore they can be developed to the exclusion of all others. They have boundaries, either subtle or gross, and this can be selectively worked on. But the situation is somewhat different with the level, quote-unquote, level of unity consciousness, because unity consciousness is not a partial state. Instead, it is all-inclusive in the most radical way, as a mirror equally includes all the objects it reflects. Unity consciousness is not a state different or apart from other states, but the condition and true nature of all states. If it were different from any state, for example, if it were different from your awareness right now, then that would imply it had a boundary, that it had something to separate it from your present awareness. But unity consciousness has no boundaries, so there is nothing to separate from anything. Enlightenment flashes clear in this moment, and this moment, and this. Perhaps a simple analogy will help explain the point. The different levels of the spectrum are something like the various waves of the ocean. Each wave is certainly different from all others. Some waves near the shore are strong and powerful, while others further out are weaker and less powerful. But each wave is still different from all the others. And if you were surfing, you could select a particular wave, catch it, ride it, and work it according to your ability. You couldn't do any of this if the waves weren't different. Each level of the spectrum is like a particular wave, and thus we can catch any of them with the right technique and enough practice. Unity consciousness, however, is not so much a particular wave as it is the water itself, and there is no boundary, no difference, no separation between water and any of the waves. That is, the water is equally present in all the waves in the sense that no wave is wetter than another. So if you're looking for wetness itself, the condition of all waves, nothing whatsoever will be gained by jumping from one wave to another. In fact, there is much to lose, for as long as you are wave jumping in search of wetness, you obviously will never discover that wetness exists in its purity, or on whatever wave you're riding now. Seeking unity consciousness is like jumping from one wave of experience to another in search of water, and this is why there is neither path nor achievement. The great Zen master Hakyun seemed to have just this analogy in mind when he wrote, "Not knowing how near truth is, people seek it far away. What a pity! They are like he who, in the midst of water, cries in thirst so imploringly." So perhaps we can begin to see why, strictly speaking, there is no path to unity consciousness. Unity consciousness is not a particular experience among other experiences, not a big experience opposed to small experiences, not one wave instead of another. Rather, it is every wave of present experience just as it is. And how can you contact present experience? There's nothing but present experience. There's definitely no path to that which always is. There's no path to wetness if you're already standing shoulder deep in water. It is for all these reasons that the true sages proclaim there is no path to the absolute, no way to gain unity consciousness. Says Shankara, a Hindu, as Brahman constitutes a person's self, it is not something to be attained by that person. But Huangpo, a Buddhist, said that there is nothing to be attained is not idle talk, it is the truth. Says Eckhart, a Christian, thou shalt know God without image and without means, without path. Says Krishnamurti, a modern sage, the real is near, you do not have to search for it, and a man who seeks truth will never find it. As Eckhart puts it, there is no means to the ultimate, no techniques, no paths. This is only because it is its nature to be omnipresent, present everywhere and everyone. Our difficulty, it seems, is the same as that of the individual who jumps from wave to wave in search of wetness. We won't hold still long enough to understand our present condition, and in always looking elsewhere we are actually moving away from the answer, in the sense that if we are always looking beyond, the essential understanding of the present condition will not unfold. Our very search, our own desire, forestalls the discovery. In short, we are always trying to move away from present experience, whereas in fact it is this present experience which always holds the key to our search. We are not really searching for the answer, we are fleeing it. But does this mean that we are to do nothing? That we are to stop moving away from the present? That we are to try to fully contact the now? This seems reasonable enough until we examine it more closely. Even doing nothing is utterly beside the point, for why do we want to do nothing? Isn't that just another attempt to move away from the present wave of experience in search of a wetter one? Whether we try to do or try not to do, we still have to make a move and thus miss the point in the very first step. This, then, is the grand paradox of unity consciousness. You can't really do anything to get it. I think that it is at least theoretically clear. I think that is at least theoretically clear, that's what he said. And yet it is even more obvious that if we don't do something, we'll remain just as we are. Zen Master Matsu put it bluntly. Quote, in the Tao there is nothing to discipline oneself in. If there is any discipline in it, the completion of such discipline means the destruction of the Tao. But if there is no discipline whatsoever in the Tao, one remains an ignoramus. End quote. And so we arrive at an essential point of the major mystical traditions, namely that special conditions are appropriate but not necessary for the actualization of unity consciousness. And further, these conditions do not lead to unity consciousness, they are themselves an expression of unity consciousness. They are a formal, ritual embodiment and enjoyment of original enlightenment. Zen Buddhism, for instance, has a beautiful saying, Honsho Myoshu, which means original enlightenment is wondrous practice. Unity consciousness is not a future state which results from some practice, because that would imply that unity consciousness has a beginning in time, that it doesn't exist now but it will exist tomorrow. That would make unity consciousness a strictly temporal state, which is not acceptable at all, for unity consciousness is present eternally. That unity consciousness is always present is our Honshu, our original enlightenment. Original not because it occurred in ancient times past, but because it is the origin and the ground of this instant. Enlightenment is the origin of the present form. Myoshu, spiritual practice, is the movement or activity of this origin. It is the appropriate function of original enlightenment. Honshu Myoshu therefore means the true spiritual practice springs from, but not towards enlightenment. Our practice does not lead to unity consciousness. Our practice is unity consciousness from the beginning, from, in fact, all time, in the words of Suzuki Roshi. If our practice is only a means to attain enlightenment, there is actually no way to attain it. Enlightenment is not some good feeling or some particular state of mind. The state of mind that exists when you sit in Zazen practice is itself enlightenment. In this posture, there is no need to talk about the right state of mind. You already have it. End quote. And is this really any different from the esoteric Christian doctrine that in true prayer is it not that you are trying to reach God, and that it is God who is praying to himself? Quote, console thyself, thou wouldst not seek me if thou hadst not already found. End quote. Thus, by all accounts, our spiritual practice is itself already the goal. The end and the means, the way and the destination, the Alpha and the Omega, are one. But this raises yet another question. Why then should we practice at all if we already have a Buddha nature or original enlightenment or an inner Christ? Well, we could say why not? But the real point is that the taking up of the special conditions of spiritual practice is an appropriate expression of unity consciousness. A priceless jewel is of no earthly value whatsoever unless you can employ it, express it, manifest it. Likewise, an appropriate use of original spiritual enlightenment is spiritual activity in its fullest sphere. Even if, in our spiritual practice, it appears we are trying to attain enlightenment, we are actually only expressing it. If we take up Zazen, for instance, then deep within we are doing so not to become Buddhas, but to behave like the Buddhas we already are. To quote Suzuki Roshi once again, the understanding passed down from Buddha to our time is that when you start Zazen, there is enlightenment without any preparation. Whether you practice Zazen or not, you have Buddha nature. Because you have it, there is enlightenment in your practice. If originally we have Buddha nature, the reason we practice Zazen is that we must behave like Buddha. Our way is not to sit to acquire something, it is to express our true nature. That is our practice. Zazen practice is the direct expression of our true nature. Strictly speaking, for a human being, there is no other practice than this practice. There is no other way of life than this way of life. End of quote. Suzuki Roshi didn't mean that Buddhism per se is the only life, but that unity consciousness, or quote-unquote big mind, is the only life. And because of Honshu Myoshu, moment-to-moment practice as the joyful and grateful expression of original enlightenment is the only way to live. From this side, there is indeed no other way to live, but, as an alternative, only numerous ways to suffer. If we understand Honsho Myoshi, then everything we do is practice, is an expression of original enlightenment. Every act springs from eternity, from no boundary, and just as it is a perfect and unobstructed expression of the all. Everything we do becomes our practice, our prayer, not just zazen, chanting, the sacraments, mantra meditation, sutra recitation, or Bible readings, but everything from washing dishes to doing income taxes. And not in the sense that we wash dishes and think of our original enlightenment, but because washing dishes is itself original enlightenment. So we begin any therapy aimed at the level of unity consciousness by assuming special conditions of spiritual practice. It might be zazen, or mantra meditation, or devotion to God through Christ or Guru, or special visualization procedures. It is impossible in the space of a short chapter to outline even one of these spiritual practices, and so readers will have to rely on the recommended readings at the end of this chapter and pursue these matters on their own. What I intend to do is to provide a brief preview of some of the insights and changes that might occur to you as you proceed with spiritual practice. This may give you at least a feel for what some of these practices are like, and this help you to decide if they are worth pursuing in your case. As individuals take up the special conditions of a spiritual practice, they will begin to realize with increasing certainty and clarity, but an exasperating but unmistakable fact: nobody wants unity consciousness. At all times we are in truth resisting unity consciousness, avoiding God, fighting the Tao. It is certain that we are always wave jumping, that we are always resisting the present wave of experience, but unity consciousness and the present are one and the same thing. To resist one is to resist the other. In theological terms, we are always resisting God's presence, which is nothing but the full present in all forms. If there is some aspect of life that you dislike, there is some aspect of unity consciousness that you are resisting. Thus, we actively and secretly deny and resist unity consciousness. The understanding of a secret resistance is the ultimate key to enlightenment. But we should notice that this is not the first time we have seen some form of resistance. In fact, every major level of the spectrum is actually constituted by a particular mode of resistance. When we discussed the descent from the persona level to the ego level, the first thing we encountered was resistance to the shadow. This is why Freud, master investigator of the shadow, stated, quote, "The whole of psychoanalytic theory is in fact built up on the perception of the resistance exerted by the patient when we try to make him conscious of his unconscious," unquote. In our own exploration of shadow, we saw this resistance pop up everywhere. We saw that an individual may resist any impulse or information that is unacceptable to her self-image. This resisted material then becomes a part of her shadow, leaving the individual with nothing but a symptom in its place. The individual then resists, with basically the same resistance, her symptom. She fights her symptom of anxiety, phobia, or whatever, just as she once fought her shadow. Further, she will also resist, again the same resistance, any person unto whom she might project her own shadow. She then treats people as symptoms. The perplexing thing, especially to the individual caught in the resistance, is that she, as persona, honestly doesn't think she's resisting. She is totally unaware of it. On the surface, she thinks that if she had her way, she wouldn't suffer, she wouldn't get depressed, tense, or otherwise symptomatic. But that's only true of half of her. For the alienated half of her, the shadow loves to inflict suffering on her. So she hurts herself without knowing it. And because she doesn't know it, she cannot stop. She produces her own symptoms, but won't admit it, and thus she ends up defending her suffering. Until she sees her own resistance to her shadow, no progress whatsoever is gained, for she will continue to resist and therefore sabotage any effort at growth. So the first and most difficult task of the personal level therapist is to help the individual understand and work through her resistance to her shadow. The therapist doesn't try to get rid of any of the resistance, bypass them, or ignore them. Instead, the therapist helps the individual see how, and secondly, why she is resisting her own shadow. Once the person sees that she is, in concrete fact, resisting aspects of herself, and this is really the whole crux of her difficulty, then the person is in a position to gently lower her resistance and begin to touch her shadow and not avoid it, resist it, or repress it. If, however, the individual tried to directly contact the shadow first without taking into account her resistances, then she would simply redouble her efforts to resist and expel the shadow, since she has ignored the very root cause of the problem. In psychoanalysis, for example, which embodies a very consistent approach to the shadow, the person will be asked to take up free associations. He will be instructed to say anything and everything that comes into his mind, no matter how outrageous, inconsequential, or even silly it seems. The person will begin, and ideas will start to flow in chains of association, remembrances, and fantasies. But, rather suddenly, he will invariably hit some sort of snarl. He might go blank, or perhaps get embarrassed, or simply freeze. In starting to free associate, he lowered his resistance, his chronic censorship over his thoughts, and in a matter of minutes, under this free and unguarded atmosphere, a shadow idea or impulse has come naturally to the surface, an idea or impulse that he heretofore has warded off and resisted. As soon as the shadow thought starts to pop up, the individual goes blank in defense. He resists it and then halts the free flow of associations. The therapist will point this out. He will not confront the person with a shadow thought, but merely begin to explore the person's feelings of resistance to some of his own thoughts. By persistently exploring this resistance in all its forms, the therapist will help the individual to regain his ability to freely range through all his own thoughts, past, present, and future, without any resistance. Eventually, the individual will no longer resist his own impulses and ideas, his own shadow, and thus will have developed a more accurate and acceptable self-image. This was the first type of resistance that we discovered. The persona resists the shadow and thus prevents the discovery and emergence of the accurate ego. And as we move down to the next major level of the spectrum, we find a resistance displayed by the ego itself. It is the ego's resistance to the feeling attention of the centaur. Part of this resistance is an inability to maintain true present-centered awareness, or feeling attention, for any length of time. Because centauric awareness is grounded in the passing present, the ego's resistance to the centaur is a resistance to the immediate here and now. Since it operates basically in time, scanning the past and pressing the future and thinking itself tends to be a resistance to the centaur. So thinking itself tends to be a resistance to the centaur. In ego therapies, one works with resistance in and to the thought process. In centauric therapies, thought itself is a resistance. In fact, from the deeper view of the centaur level, even the therapeutic technique employed on the ego level is a form of resistance. This is why Fritz Perls, the centaur level therapist par excellence, could state, quote, "As avoidance, resistance is assumed to be the central symptom of nervous disorders, I have replaced the method of free association, or flight of ideas, by that anecdote of avoidance, concentration." Unquote. And concentration on what? Nothing but the immediate present in all its forms and the body-mind awareness which discloses it. Perls soon abandoned the somewhat misleading term concentration and replaced it with awareness of the here and now. And according to Perls, it is the avoidance or resistance of the centauric here and now that constitutes most pathologies. Thus, in centaur therapies, such as Gestalt, the individual is not asked to let her thoughts run as they please, but rather to suspend mental chatter and focus awareness on the immediate here and now. The therapist will watch, not for the blocks in thoughts, but for any flight from present awareness into thought. The therapist will point out this resistance or avoidance of the here and now to the person until the person herself understands how she avoids the centaur by escaping into the ego. In ego-level therapy, a person will be encouraged to explore her past. In centaur-level therapy, she will be prevented from it. A different type of resistance is operative in each case. The different techniques have evolved to handle them, each technique being valid and appropriate on its own level. So we are starting to see how each level of the spectrum is marked, among numerous other things, by different modes of resistance or avoidance. On the personal level, we resist unity with the shadow in all its forms. On the ego level, we resist unity with the centaur in all its qualities. And finally, as we will now see on the centaur level itself, and extending to the transpersonal bands, we find the ultimate and primordial resistance to unity consciousness. We have also seen how each different resistance resulted in a person's seeing different aspects of himself as if they were objects out there. The shadow appeared as an alien object out there. The body appeared as a foreign object down there. In the same way, the very root resistance at the base of the spectrum also results in seeing some aspect of oneself as if they were objects out there. But at this level, pervasive as it is, these external objects constitute nothing other than the whole environment itself, whether the environment be gross, subtle, personal, or transpersonal. The trees, the stars, the sun, the moon, these environmental objects are just as much a part of our real self as the shadow is our egoic self, and the body is our centauric self. This primal resistance results in what we call perception. That is to say, we perceive all sorts of objects as if they were separate from us. And we resist, we actually fight the awareness of unity with all these perceived objects, just as we once fought unity with the shadow and the unity with the whole-bodied centaur. We fight, in short, unity consciousness. Thus we are brought back to our major point. Through assuming appropriate spiritual practice, we start to learn just how we resist unity consciousness. Spiritual practice forces this fundamental resistance to surface in our awareness. We begin to see that we don't really want unity consciousness, but that we are always avoiding it. But that itself is the crucial insight, just as the understanding of our resistance on every other level was a pivotal insight. To see our resistance to unity consciousness is to be able, for the first time, to deal with it and finally to drop it, thus removing the secret obstacle to our own liberation. How do these special conditions of spiritual practice reveal to us our resistance to unity consciousness? What, after all, is so special about them? Of the infinite number of activities that we could pursue, why do the ones called spiritual work, if we may put it so pragmatically? What is so unique about zazen, or deep contemplation, or devotion to God or Guru? Why are they effective? If we can start to understand this, we will have gone a long way in deciphering the paradox of the Great Liberation. To begin with, notice that this is really not the first time we have run up against special conditions. Like the resistance, we have seen them before in different names. We have seen in the last 3 chapters that the therapies of each and every level impose special conditions upon the individual. Each different therapy has its own particular practices and special techniques that it imposes on the individual who seeks that level of growth. Without these special conditions, nothing whatsoever would result, except stalemate. These conditions are obviously different for each level. But what is it that they all have in common that allows them to be effective? In other words, let us ask, why do any of these special conditions work? The answer seems to be that each type of condition frustrates a type of resistance. A few short examples will clarify this. We have just noticed that psychoanalysis, which deals primarily with the descent from persona to ego, uses the special conditions of free association. Now, the ego can free associate with little difficulty, for there are few thoughts or wishes that are totally unacceptable to an accurate ego. The persona, however, can free associate only with the greatest difficulty, because the moment it relaxes its chronic censorship, unwanted and acceptable thoughts spring to the surface. Free association thus proceeds at best in hot spurts. The therapist is trained to recognize these blocks as signs of resistance and points them out to the individual. Because the individual is directed to assume the special condition, his resistance show up very easily. Further, since he has to keep trying to free associate, keep presuming the special condition, his resistances are slowly frustrated. You cannot resist and free associate at the same time. The moment the individual can easily maintain the special condition of unobstructed free association, the therapy is greatly facilitated. The same factor is at work in the special conditions of centaur level therapy. For instance, a person might be told to drop all thoughts of yesterday and tomorrow and pay strict feeling attention to the immediate here and now, the nunc fluens of the passing present of existential awareness. This is precisely the special condition. This condition is something the total organism can do with relative ease, but even the accurate ego cannot. For the ego is built upon time, upon successive glances to the past and future, and it withers under the light of present awareness. So, the ego will resist the passing present. It will fight the special conditions, and always be floating into thoughts of yesterday and tomorrow. The therapist, as always, gently enforces the conditions, and thus frustrates the resistance to this level, and the movements away from the immediate passing present. Without these conditions, the individual might never even know she was resisting. So the special conditions of each level show your resistance and at the same time frustrate them. Actually, they show you your resistances by frustrating them. If your resistances weren't frustrated, you probably wouldn't even suspect their existence. You would continue their secret exercise, the sabotaging growth. Further, by frustrating your resistance, the conditions allow you to realize a deeper state of no resistance. In fact, the conditions of any one level are actually what a person on the next deepest level can do. That is, the special therapeutic conditions of any level are one or more of the actual characteristics of the level beneath it. By assuming the characteristics of the deeper level of the special conditions of your present practice, your resistance to that deeper level is exposed, frustrated, and undermined, thus returning you to the deeper level itself. So, we now return to the primal resistance itself, which the special condition of all true spiritual practice exposes and then frustrates, undermines, and dissolves. It is this primal resistance to unity consciousness that we must approach, not unity consciousness itself. For until you can see precisely how you resist unity consciousness, all your efforts to achieve it will be in vain, because what you are trying to achieve is also what you are consciously resisting and trying to prevent. We secretly resist unity consciousness, we covertly manufacture the symptoms of non-enlightenment, just as we secretly produce all our other symptoms on a different level of the spectrum. What on the surface we fervently desire, in the depths of success we successfully prevent. And this resistance is our real difficulty. Thus, we won't be moved towards unity consciousness, we will simply understand how we are always moving away from it, and that understanding itself might allow a glimpse of unity consciousness, for that which sees resistance is itself free of resistance. The primal resistance, like all other resistances operating throughout the spectrum, is not something that happens to you, nor is it something that happens in the past, nor is it something that occurs without your consent. Rather, it is a present activity, something you are doing without realizing it. And it is this primal activity which tends to block unity consciousness. But simply, it is a global unwillingness to look upon everything as it is now. But concretely, there is something that you won't look at in this present. On the whole, there exists a global resistance to and non-acceptance of the entire quality of present experience. Not just resistance to a particular present experience or some defined and evident aspect of present experience, but the global present in all its dimensions. As you will see, this is not a resistance to a passing present, the nunc fluens of the centaur level, but a resistance to the eternal present, the nunc stans, that is unity consciousness. Because of its global nature, this resistance is not really something you can clearly perceive and think about. It is rather something very subtle. Wild and dramatic resistances occur mostly in the upper level, but at the base of the spectrum, this primal resistance is subtle and diffuse. But most of us can inwardly feel and intuit it. Somehow, we just don't seem to completely accept our total present state. There's a tiny inward tension that seems to push us away from the global present. Thus, we won't allow our awareness to rest naturally on all that is now. We tend to look away. There is, then, this global unwillingness to look upon everything as a whole as it is, just as it is now. We tend to look away, to withdraw awareness from what is, to avoid the present in all its forms. And because we tend to look away, we tend to move away. With this subtle resistance, the looking and moving away, we seem to block unity consciousness. We seem to lose our true nature. This loss of unity consciousness throws us into a world of boundaries, space, time, suffering, and mortality. Yet as we move through this world of boundaries and battles, we are motivated basically by one thing, the desire to recapture unity consciousness, to discover once again the territory of no boundary. All of our desires, wants, intentions, and wishes are ultimately substitute gratifications. For unity consciousness, not only half satisfying, not only half satisfying and therefore half frustrating. So, although the only thing a person fundamentally wants is unity consciousness, the only thing she is ever doing is resisting it. We are always looking for unity consciousness, but in a way that always prevents the discovery. We look for unity consciousness by moving away from the present. We imagine that somehow this present is not quite right. It's not just quite it, and hence we are not globally present in this moment, but start to instead to move away from it towards what we imagine will be a new and better present. We begin, in other words, to wave jump. We begin to move in space and time to secure for ourselves an ultimate wave, the wave that will finally quench our thirst, that will finally give us wetness. Looking for wetness on the next wave of level of experience, we always miss it in our present wave. To search forever is to miss it forever. The problem is that in order to resist the present wave of experience, sorry, I wasn't sure I had that, you have to separate yourself from it. To move away from present experience implies that you and the present experience are two different things. By continually trying to move away from now, you continually reinforce the illusion that you are outside the now. By trying to move away from the present world, it appears that you are separate from the world. In just this way, we erect the primary boundary between ourself on the one hand and the world on the other. This is why we said earlier that the perception of an objective world out there is a resistance to, and thus separation from, our present experience. To move away from now is to separate yourself from unity consciousness, and thus to begin the evolution of the spectrum. That first cause, of which we spoke so mysteriously in Chapter 6, is nothing but this moving away, which is embodied in the primary boundary. This is why we said, the primary boundary, this perpetually active first cause, is our going in this moment. It is a simple looking and moving away. The moment we resist the one world of present experience, we necessarily divide that world. We divide it into an inside experience, which we feel as a seer, experiencer, actor, versus an outside experience, which we feel as a seen, experienced, and acted upon. Our world is split in two, and a boundary, an illusory boundary, is placed between you, the experiencer, and it, the experienced. The evolution of the spectrum has started. The war of the opposites has begun. Our world is also split in yet another basic way. To continually move away from the global present implies that there is a future which will accept this movement. We move away because we imagine there is another time in which we can move. To move away is thus nothing more than to move in time. In fact, it is to create a time. For by moving away from the timeless and present experience, or rather by trying to move away, we generate the illusion that experience itself likewise moves past us. By our resisting the eternal and global present, it is reduced to the passing present. Experiences then seem to pass by us, one by one, in a linear way, not only because we are running past them in a flight from now, but only because we are running past them in a flight from now. That, as we earlier saw, is the fear of death, the fear of having no future, the fear of not being able to move away. As we try to move away from the present world, the world appears to move past us. The eternal present thus appears bounded, constricted, and limited. It is sandwiched on the one side by all the experiences we have run past, and on the other side by all the future moments we are trying to run into. Thus, to move away is to create a before and after, a point of departure in the past, from which we move to a point of departure, to which we move. Our present is reduced to the moving itself, the quiet running away. Our moments pass. Thus, from all sides, to move away is to separate ourselves from present experience and to project ourselves into time, history, destiny, and death. This, then, is our primal resistance, the unwillingness to look upon all experience as a whole, as it is now, in an attempt instead to globally move away. In this global resistance that the special conditions of spiritual practice uncover and then it is this global resistance that the special conditions of spiritual practice uncover and then frustrate. As a person assumes the conditions, he starts to recognize that he is always moving away from the global present. He begins to see that by always moving away, he is merely resisting and preventing unity consciousness, or God's will, the flow of Tao, the love for Guru, or original enlightenment. By any other name, he resists his present. He looks away, he moves away, he therefore suffers. But in a sense, he makes progress. He starts to see his primal resistance and thus to relax it. As with all other therapies, this is the honeymoon period. He's relatively happy. He is secure in his practice. He feels there is ultimately hope for liberation. He might even get as far as transpersonal witness, described in the last chapter. Because he starts to see his primal resistance, he starts to understand his enemy. He knows what has to be destroyed. He has to surrender this constant moving away, from which brings him to disaster and an abrupt end of the honeymoon. For how on earth can he stop moving away? He sees, for instance, that he is at this moment trying to move away from now. So he decides to try to stop that movement away from now. But that action of stopping in itself is nothing itself but another move. To try not to move away is still to make a move. It still requires a future movement in which this stopping might occur. Instead of stopping his moving away, he is merely moving away from moving away. In place of gross resistance, he has the same resistance on a subtler level. Approach it from a slightly different angle, he might try to stop resisting the now by attempting to be fully aware of this eternal present, exactly as it is. But trying to be aware of this present requires a future present in which this awareness might occur. So you're still moving away from now, even in trying not to. For the only present you can grasp is the passing present, and this is precisely the therapeutic technique of the centaur level. But at this deeper level, the level of unity consciousness, we are concerned with the eternal present, not the passing present, and try to grasp or seek the eternal present result. To try to grasp or seek the eternal present results only in finding a series of passing presents. To concentrate on the passing present is simply to resist eternity. For this concentration on the passing present requires a series of quick grasps in time, essential for the centaur level, but beside the point with unity consciousness. For this internal present is this moment, before you try to grasp it. It's what you know before you know anything else, what you see before you see anything else, what you are before you are anything else. To try to grasp it requires a move, to try not to grasp it also requires a move. Either way, he misses it right off. At this point in his quest, the individual starts to feel hemmed in on all sides. Nothing he can do seems right. To halt resisting, he has to resist. To seek the timeless, he now requires a split second of time. To stop moving away, he still has to make a move. And so it slowly starts to dawn on him that everything he does is a resistance. It is not that he sometimes resists and sometimes doesn't, but that, as long as he recognizes time and is aware of a separate self, he is only resisting and moving away. All he is ever doing is moving away, and this includes all his clever attempts not to move away. He cannot, in truth, make a move without resisting, because every move is, by definition, resistance itself. On each of the upper levels of the spectrum, there was some action by which, by the standards of the particular level, was not a resistance. For example, free association on the ego level and attention to the passing present on the centaur level was not resistance, at least not in the frameworks of those levels. In all those cases, a person could therefore choose to resist and choose not to resist. He had alternatives. There was his self on the one hand, persona, ego, centaur, or transpersonal, and his resistance on the other. But here, at the base of the spectrum, there is no alternative. Therapy on every upper level was the overthrowing of a gross resistance by strengthening a subtler one. But here there is no subtle resistance. Subtler resistance. The individual no longer has an alternative to resistance, for everything he does is resistance. He has chased resistance to the limits of the spectrum, and here it encloses him. And there is a special reason for this, because, which he begins to intuit, his separate self always seems to be resisting, because the sensation of the separate self and the sensation of resistance are one and the same thing. That inner feeling of being a separate self is nothing but a feeling of moving away, resisting, contracting, standing alone, looking away, grasping. When you feel yourself, that's all you feel. This is the reason that everything he tried to do or tried not to do was wrong, was just more resistance and more moving away. Everything which he did was wrong because he was doing it. His self is resistance, and thus could not stop resistance. At this point, things indeed seem bleak. The individual seems nothing but a trap set to perpetually snare himself. The dark night of the soul sets in, and the light of consciousness seems to turn back on itself and disappear, leaving no trace. All seems lost, and in a sense all is. Darkness follows darkness, emptiness leads to emptiness, midnight lingers on. But, as Zenhirk has it, quote, "At dusk the cock announces dawn, at midnight the bright sun." End quote. For reasons we will soon explain, at this very point, where absolutely everything seems wrong, everything spontaneously becomes right. When the individual truly sees that every move he makes is a move away, a resistance, then the entire mechanism of resistance winds down. When he sees this resistance in every move he makes, then quite spontaneously he surrenders resistance altogether. And the surrendering of this resistance is the opening of unity consciousness, the actualization of no boundary awareness. He awakens, as if from a long and foggy dream, to find that he knew all along he, as a separate self, does not exist. His real self, the All, was never born, will never die. There is only consciousness as such in all directions, absolute and all-pervading, radiant through and as all conditions, the source and suchness of everything that arises moment to moment, utterly prior to this world, but not other than this world. All things are just a ripple in this pond, all arising in a gesture of this one. We have seen then that the special conditions of spiritual practice show the individual all of his resistances, while simultaneously frustrating them at the very deepest level. In short, the conditions show us our wave jumping and then make it finally impossible. The turning point comes when the person sees that everything he does is nothing but wave jumping, resisting, moving away from now in search of wetter waves. Spiritual practice, whether a person realizes it in these terms or not, hinges on this primal pivot. For until he sees that absolutely everything he does is resistance, he will secretly continue to move away, to grasp, to seek, and thus to totally prevent the discovery. He will move away without realizing he is moving away. If he doesn't see that all his actions are resistance, he will still believe that there is some move he can make to get unity consciousness. Until he sees that everything he does is nothing but moving away, he will simply continue to move away. He will think he has a choice, an alternative, something to do, some way up. And so he continues to make a move in which is always away, and thus a move that erects a barrier to unity consciousness, which was not there to begin with. The reason he doesn't get unity consciousness is because he wants to. But at the very point he sees that everything he does is resistance, so looking away and moving away, he has no choice but to surrender. He cannot, however, try to do this or try not to. We have seen that doesn't work at all, for both tries are just more movings away. Rather, it happens of itself spontaneously when he sees that nothing he can do or not do will work, because unity is always already the case. The very seeing of the resistance is the dissolution of the resistance and the acknowledgement of the prior unity. Once this primal resistance begins to dissolve, one's separate self dissolves with it. For it is not that you, on the one hand, see you're moving away on the other. It might start this way, with you as a separate self, seeing the resistance as an activity of yours. But as you begin to see that everything you do is a resistance, you start to see that even your feelings of being separate self in here is also nothing but a resistance. When you feel yourself, and if all you feel, when you feel yourself, all you feel is a tiny inner tension, a subtle contraction, a subtle moving away. The feeling of self and the feeling of moving away are one and the same. But as this becomes obvious, there are no longer two different feelings here. No longer an experiencer on the one hand having an experience on the other hand, but only one single all-pervasive feeling, the feeling of resistance. You don't feel this resistance. You are this feeling of resistance. The feeling of self condenses into the feeling of resistance, and both dissolve. Thus, to the extent this primal resistance dissolves, your separation from the world also dissolves. There spontaneously comes a deep and total surrender of resistance, of the unwillingness to gaze upon the present in all its forms, and thus a complete dissolution of your primary boundary you erected between inside and out. When you no longer are resisting present experience, you no longer have a motive to separate yourself from it. The world and the self return as one single experience, not two different ones. No longer do we wave jump, for there's only one wave and it's everywhere. Further, when we are no longer moving away from experience, experience no longer seems to move past us. To no longer resist the present is to see that there is nothing but the present, no beginning, no end, nothing behind it, nothing in front of it. When the past of memory and the future of anticipation are both seen to be present facts, then the slats of this present collapse. The boundaries around this moment fall into this moment, and then there is nothing but this moment, with nowhere else to go. Said an old Zen master, myself of long ago, in nature non-existent, nowhere to go when dead, nothing at all. End quote. It thus becomes apparent why the search for unity consciousness was so exasperating. Everything we tried to do was wrong, because everything was already and eternally right. And what appeared as a primal resistance to Brahma was actually a movement of Brahman, because there is nothing but Brahman. There never was, nor ever will be, any time other than now. What appeared as a primal moving away from the now was really an original movement of now. Honsho Myoshi, the original enlightenment, is wondrous practice. The eternal now is its movements. The ocean waves surge freely against the shore, wetting the pebbles and shells. Recommendations. For the Hindu approach, one can do no better than the illustrious Sri Ramana Maharshi. Arthur Osborne has collected most of his works and edited them into superb volumes. See especially the collected works of Ramana Maharshi and the teachings of Ramana Maharshi. For the Buddhist approach, we have three main lines. For the Theravada, or early Buddhism, see Nyani Ponika Thera, the heart of Buddhist meditation. For Vajrayana, or Tibetan Buddhism, Chogyam Trungpa's books are illuminating, especially cutting through spiritual materialism and the myth of freedom. Excellent material by Tarthang Tulka can be found in issues of The Crystal Mirror. For the Zen approach, the entire series of writing coming out of the Zen Center of Los Angeles, The Hazy Moon of Enlightenment, The Way of Everyday Life, to Forget the Self. Suzuki Roshi's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, is a masterpiece, and Philip Kaplan's The Three Pillars of Zen remain a small classic. Two other approaches should be mentioned, neither of which is traditional. Krishnamurti, whose insights we have really drawn from in this book, eloquently speaks through his many works, of which The First and Last Freedom and Commentaries on Living may be especially mentioned. The works of Baba Free John are unsuppressed. See The Enlightenment of the Whole Body. These approaches, or ones similar, seem to me the only ones both strong and gentle enough to elicit true understanding in the midst of present activity. Real spiritual practice is not something we do for 20 minutes a day, for 2 hours a day, or for 6 hours a day. It is not something we do once a day in the morning or once a week on the Sunday. Spiritual practice is not one activity among other human activities. It is just the ground of all human activities, their source and their validation. It is a prior commitment to transcendent truth lived, breathed, intuited, and practiced 24 hours a day. To intuit your real self is to commit your entire being to the actualization of that self in all beings, or according to the primordial view, quote, however innumerable beings are, I vow to liberate them. However incomparable the truth is, I vow to actualize it, unquote. If you feel this deep commitment to realization, to service, to sacrifice, and to surrender, through all present conditions to infinity itself, then spiritual practice will be your way naturally. May you be graced to find a spiritual master in this life and enlightenment in this moment. End. Reader's commentary. So, I'll say about the last two chapters. One, I noticed in the penultimate chapter that a lot of the reading was like in the front of the mouth, and it was really choppy. It was like lots of and then in the next chapter, it was much more round in the mouth, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if he was doing that on purpose or if it just kind of came out that way. The chapter 8 about the self and transcendence was very, that it was sort of like I felt like it was trying to convince with a logical argument, like, like premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, and therefore conclusion. I was just looking at some work by a man, Shalom Schwartz, who identified 10 human values that are shared by apparently everybody around the world. And spiritualism, thus to this research, isn't one of them, which I thought was interesting because Wilber sort of assumes that it is a universal. Well, who knows? But anyway, I think that to try to get at this through logic and logical arguments is not doesn't really serve. But that said, we are overly intellectualized in our lives, and so I can see the value of this kind of work and this kind of approach. And like in the last chapter, it's like he just kind of goes through says the same thing, coming at it not like from one angle and another, but just like kind of the same angle over and over again, like backwards, backwards and forwards. And it seemed like maybe some people need to hear that, but I think by the time you get to that chapter, maybe it would have been simpler just to make it shorter. But that's okay. So the last two comments that I would say are that, in a sense, a lot of this felt like sort of a teachings on dependent origination, just identifying the sort of the steps, which is, you know, this second point, which is, some say, like a really deep and difficult teaching. And I just came across some talks by John Peacock, grace of a person I'm taking a class with, and so thankful to him, Paul. Anyway, and I love what John Peacock said about, he's talking about Buddhism, and I think that this is also true about all spiritual teachings, which is that it's like, it's really simple. The lessons are really simple. People say they're really complex, and it's, you know, it's like really hard to get. But I think these lessons really are very, very simple. And it's not hard to grasp them intellectually at all. I don't think any of this stuff is hard to grasp intellectually. I agree with him. But that what is, what he calls profound, and we might say hard to get, is the actual experience of them. And in a way, it's like kind of words get in the way. And I feel like in that last chapter, words did kind of get in the way, where you're like, okay, you know, if that's what it is, like, why are you talking about it so much? Well, anyway, those are my comments, which don't really mean anything. Anyway,